In a room designed for power, the quietest voice often carries the greatest threat. Crystal chandeliers glowed softly above a grand hall nearly the size of a full basketball court, their golden light cascading across marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting every tailored suit, every diamond bracelet, every confident smile that had never once been challenged, never once been doubted. And gathered at the heart of that room was a long, gleaming table where the world's most privileged young elites sat poised, each one ready to prove they deserved to be there. Resumes stamped with Ivy League credentials, global fellowships, and connections that stretched across continents. Their laughter smooth and effortless, rehearsed in rooms just like this, while at the far edges of the same space, moving between them with quiet precision, was Lily Carter, balancing a silver tray with steady, practiced hands, her footsteps soft enough to disappear into the background, her presence carefully minimized as if she had learned from an early age that being unnoticed was safer than being seen, that observing the world was more powerful than trying to belong to it. And yet her eyes absorbed everything, every subtle shift in posture, every flicker of competition behind polite smiles, and especially the moment the massive doors opened, because the energy in the room changed instantly, conversations dropping half a tone, shoulders straightening as Sheikh Omar al-Hadi stepped inside, a man whose influence alone could shape futures, whose approval could open doors no amount of wealth could buy. And as he moved toward the head of the table, the atmosphere tightened, anticipation sharpening into something almost electric, because everyone knew this was not just another elite gathering. This was a test, a rare and whispered challenge known only in the highest circles, one that separated those who were merely impressive from those who were truly exceptional. And when the Sheikh finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, yet carried effortlessly across the entire hall, introducing a challenge that had nothing to do with money or status, but instead demanded something far more difficult to imitate: depth, cultural fluency, true understanding. And then he began speaking in Arabic, his words fluid and precise, layered with meaning, flowing like a current too deep for most to navigate beyond the surface. And immediately the candidates leaned in, their expressions sharpening, eager to respond, calculating every phrase, preparing to impress. While at the edge of the table, Lily paused for the briefest moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray as recognition settled in, because she understood every word, every subtle nuance, every hidden layer woven into the language. Yet almost instinctively she lowered her gaze, stepping back into the quiet rhythm of service as though that knowledge did not belong to her, as though a girl in her position had no place engaging in such a test. And then the Sheikh posed his question, intricate and poetic, drawn from classical text and wrapped in metaphor and cultural depth, and in an instant the room's confidence fractured, smiles stiffened, eyes darted from one face to another, the silence stretching far longer than anyone anticipated, long enough for discomfort to take root, long enough for doubt to quietly spread. And in that silence, unnoticed by nearly everyone, Lily became completely still, her breathing slowing, her thoughts already forming an answer she knew no one else in that room had reached. And just before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now back to Lily, because in a room filled with voices trained to impress, it was the one voice that had never been invited to speak that was about to change everything. The silence did not shatter in a single moment. It unraveled gradually, like a delicate thread being pulled loose from an otherwise flawless fabric, and one by one the candidates shifted in their seats, subtle at first, a cufflink adjusted here, a quiet clearing of the throat there, each person stepping forward with answers that sounded refined on the surface but hollow underneath, responses that circled the meaning without ever truly reaching it. And Sheikh Omar al-Hadi remained still throughout it all, offering no interruption, no correction, only observation, his expression calm and unreadable, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, as though he were not measuring what they said, but rather what they failed to grasp. And across the room, Vanessa Whitmore leaned back slightly in her chair, her confidence untouched, her posture relaxed with the ease of someone who had never been seriously challenged. Her smile edged with quiet impatience as she glanced at the others, clearly unimpressed, because in her world hesitation signaled weakness and silence meant failure. And when her turn finally came, she spoke without pause, her voice smooth and controlled, her pronunciation carefully practiced, delivering an answer that sounded convincing enough to anyone unfamiliar with the depth of the question. And for a brief moment, a few heads nodded in relief, eager to align themselves with certainty. But the sheik did not react, not even the smallest sign of approval, only a stillness that spoke louder than any critique. And that was when the discomfort deepened, when the room began to sense that confidence alone would not be enough here. And near the far end of the table, Lily stepped forward once more, refilling a glass that did not need to be refilled, her presence passing like a shadow, barely acknowledged, dismissed without thought by those who never considered her worth noticing. Yet inside her mind the answer had already taken full shape, every layer of meaning unfolding clearly, every historical reference connecting with quiet precision. She could almost hear her father's voice beside her, steady and patient, guiding her through texts most people had never even encountered, evenings spent in their small apartment with worn books stacked in uneven piles, his finger tracing lines of Arabic script while explaining not just the language but the deeper meaning behind it. And she remembered how he used to tell her that language was not simply something you spoke, it was something you carried within you, something that revealed who you truly were when everything else was stripped away. And now, standing in a room where everything else was on display, wealth, status, privilege, she felt that truth pressing gently against her chest, asking to be acknowledged, asking to be heard. But she kept her gaze lowered, her expression composed, because she also understood her place in that room, understood how quickly a single misstep could draw attention not of curiosity but of judgment. And across the table, Vanessa noticed her hesitation, noticed the way Lily lingered just a fraction too long within earshot, and a faint smirk curved across her lips, subtle but unmistakably sharp, the kind shaped by years of never being questioned. And she tilted her head slightly, watching Lily as though she were something mildly entertaining, something insignificant. And in that moment the distance between them felt greater than the size of the room itself, not measured in feet but in assumptions, in privilege given versus strength quietly earned. And still the question remained unanswered, suspended in the air, waiting, as the sheik's gaze moved slowly across the room once again, not searching for the loudest voice, but for the one person who understood what had never been explicitly said. Vanessa allowed the silence to linger just long enough for it to turn uneasy before she leaned forward slightly, her voice slicing cleanly through the room with a polished confidence that immediately drew attention. And with a subtle flick of her wrist, she gestured toward Lily, as if indicating something minor, something ornamental rather than important, and several guests nearby followed her motion out of curiosity, their eyes settling on the one person who had not been part of the discussion until that moment. And Vanessa's smile widened, not with warmth but with intention, the kind of expression that carried an unspoken provocation, and she suggested, almost playfully, that perhaps they had all been overlooking a hidden expert among them, perhaps someone who had been listening more carefully than anyone else. And a soft wave of laughter moved through the group, hesitant at first, but quickly gaining confidence as the implication became clear. And Lily paused for the briefest fraction of a second, her grip tightening slightly around the tray before she steadied it again, her posture composed, respectful, controlled. Yet now every gaze in that corner of the room had shifted toward her, assessing her, defining her instantly without needing introductions. And Vanessa continued, her tone light, but edged with unmistakable condescension, proposing that Lily should try answering the question. After all, she had been standing close enough to hear every word. And the laughter sharpened, no longer uncertain but directed, carrying with it the shared assumption that this was nothing more than a harmless joke, a fleeting distraction before returning to the real contenders. And for a moment it seemed the entire room silently agreed, reinforcing the belief that someone like Lily could not possibly belong in a conversation like this. And Lily lowered her eyes, not out of embarrassment but out of careful thought, because she recognized exactly what this moment represented. It was not an invitation but a different kind of test, one where the outcome had already been decided by those watching. and yet beneath her stillness something steady remained, something unshaken, built over years of quiet discipline, long nights spent studying while others slept, and she felt her father's presence again, not as a distant memory, but as a quiet certainty, as though every lesson he had ever given her had been leading her to this precise moment. And across the table, Sheikh Omar al-Hadi observed everything without interruption, his attention shifting from Vanessa to Lily, not with dismissal or amusement, but with genuine curiosity, as though he had noticed something no one else had, and the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, a tension forming that even those who had laughed could now sense, something quiet but undeniable, and Lily slowly raised her gaze, not fully, not boldly, but just enough to meet the edge of the moment, and for the first time she did not step back, did not retreat into the safety of invisibility. She simply remained where she was, the tray balanced steadily in her hands, her silence no longer passive but intentional. And within that silence the laughter began to fade, not because anyone had spoken, but because something in her composure no longer matched the role they had assigned to her. And the question still lingered in the air, unanswered and waiting, but now for the first time it carried a different weight, as if the answer might come from the one person no one had ever truly considered. The room did not settle after Lily's silence. Instead, it seemed to tighten around her, as if the very air had grown denser, and every breath required more awareness, more restraint. And Sheikh Omar al-Hadi finally leaned forward slightly, breaking a stillness he had maintained with deliberate control, his movement small, but enough to shift the entire atmosphere so sharply that even the faintest remaining whispers vanished. And when he spoke again, it was no longer directed broadly at the guests, but aimed precisely at the unanswered questions still suspended between them, his voice calm, yet weighted with authority that made even the most self-assured candidates straighten in their chairs without realizing it. And he repeated a portion of the original Arabic phrase slowly, carefully, as if testing its structure again in real time, inviting not memorization but comprehension, not surface translation but depth of meaning. And once more the room attempted answers, hesitant interpretations, rising like fragile steps only to collapse under scrutiny, each response circling the idea without ever fully touching its core, and none of them reaching the certainty he was looking for, none of them carrying the depth the question demanded. And Vanessa shifted in her seat for the first time with visible discomfort, her earlier confidence now strained by a subtle irritation she could not fully suppress, because what had started as a playful moment of attention had transformed into something heavier, something that could not be controlled through charm or presence alone. And Lily remained still at the edge of the room, her posture unchanged, composed, almost invisible in its restraint, yet her attention had fully shifted inward, no longer focused on the people around her, but on the architecture of the question itself, the rhythm embedded in the phrasing, the cultural references layered beneath the surface, the historical weight carried within each word that most in the room treated as decorative complexity, but she recognized as essential structure, and in her mind the meaning unfolded with quiet clarity, aligning itself with memories she had never spoken aloud. Pages of classical Arabic texts worn from years of handling, explanations her father had given her in patient, unhurried evenings, correcting her pronunciation not with criticism but with care, reminding her that language was never just sound but intention, context, and inherited understanding. And across the table, Sheikh Omar al-Hadi's gaze shifted once again, this time resting on Lily longer, more deliberately, as if something in her stillness had finally registered beyond background presence, as if he were no longer merely observing the room, but isolating a detail everyone else had overlooked. And Vanessa noticed that shift too, her eyes narrowing slightly as she followed the direction of his attention, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly as discomfort replaced amusement, because attention in this room was not casual, it was currency, and it was now being redirected toward the one person she had dismissed without a second thought. And without fully weighing her words, she leaned forward again, attempting to reclaim control of the moment with a light remark suggesting that even if someone happened to understand fragments of the language, it did not necessarily mean they could grasp the full depth required at this level of discourse. But her voice no longer carried the same ease. It sounded thinner now, less certain, as if it were being spoken against a current she could no longer influence. And before her words could settle fully into the air, Sheikh Omar raised a hand slightly, not sharply, not dismissively, but with a quiet finality that carried more authority than any interruption. And the room responded instantly, falling into absolute silence. And in that enforced pause, something fundamental shifted, because Lily, for the first time, took a full breath that felt less like preparation for performance and more like the beginning of revelation, as if something long held back was finally aligning into form, and every eye in the room, whether willingly or not, began to drift toward her, drawn by a change they could not yet name, but could already feel taking shape. The silence that followed felt different now, no longer empty but concentrated, as if the entire room had been drawn into a single invisible point where something irreversible was about to happen. And Lily remained still for another heartbeat, her hands steady, her posture unchanged, yet something in her expression had softened into quiet certainty. And when she finally stepped forward, it was not sudden or dramatic, but controlled, deliberate, as though she had been walking toward this moment far longer than anyone realized. And the faint sound of her shoes against the polished marble floor seemed louder than it should have been, each step cutting through the remaining uncertainty in the air. And Vanessa instinctively leaned back, her earlier confidence now replaced with a tension she could not disguise, while Sheikh Omar al-Hadi watched without blinking, his attention now fully anchored on Lily, as if the room had narrowed to only her presence. And Lily stopped at the edge of the table where the question had been left unresolved, her eyes briefly lowering as if recalling something deeply familiar. And when she spoke, it was in Arabic, clear, precise, and unexpectedly fluent, the sound carrying a natural rhythm that did not feel rehearsed but lived, as if the language had always belonged to her. And a subtle shift moved through the room immediately, not loud, not visible, but unmistakable, because this was not the response anyone had anticipated. And she continued without hesitation, breaking down the structure of the phrase, explaining the layered meaning behind each word, the historical context that shaped its usage, and the cultural weight that most of the room had completely overlooked. And as she spoke, the initial surprise in the faces around her deepened into disbelief, because it was not just accuracy, it was depth, and depth was something no resume in this room had promised. And Vanessa's expression tightened as she tried to follow, her confidence dissolving into confusion as the explanation continued beyond surface interpretation into something far more intricate, something that required not privilege but true study. And Sheikh Omar al-Hadi slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Lily, as if confirming something he had suspected but not allowed himself to assume. And Lily's voice remained steady throughout, neither louder nor softer, simply consistent, grounded, carrying the weight of years of unseen learning. And as she reached the final layer of interpretation, the room fell into a silence so complete it felt almost unreal, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to question, only the undeniable presence of understanding where no one had expected it to exist. And for the first time since the beginning of the gathering, the attention of every person in the room was no longer divided, no longer performative, but fully fixed on the one person they had all overlooked. The silence that followed her explanation did not fade quickly. It deepened, stretching across the entire hall like a held breath that no one dared release. And in that suspended moment, even the smallest movement felt significant. The soft shift of fabric, the careful adjustment of posture, the faint sound of glass being set down on marble, all of it amplified by the weight of what had just been spoken. And Lily remained still where she stood, her gaze lowered once more, as if returning to the role the room had assigned her long before she spoke. But the atmosphere around her had already changed in ways that could not be undone, and Sheikh Omar al-Hadi slowly rose from his seat, not abruptly but with deliberate calm, his movement drawing every eye instantly, because when a man of his influence stood without warning, it was never without meaning. And he took one step forward, then another, closing the distance toward the table where Lily stood, while Vanessa instinctively turned her head to follow, her expression caught between disbelief and growing unease. And when the sheik finally stopped, he did not look at the others, not at the assembled candidates, not at the advisors, not even at the stunned silence that filled the room. His focus remained entirely on Lily, and for several seconds he said nothing, as if allowing the weight of recognition to settle fully. And then he spoke in a lower tone, still calm, but now carrying unmistakable conviction, acknowledging not just the correctness of her answer, but the depth of understanding behind it. And as he continued, a subtle realization passed through the room, because this was no longer a test being evaluated. This was something closer to discovery, and Lily, for the first time since she stepped forward, lifted her eyes slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, not with pride, not with defiance, but with quiet composure that suggested she had never needed permission to understand what she knew. And behind her, Vanessa's composure finally fractured, her lips parting slightly as if searching for words that no longer fit the situation, because everything she had assumed about status and capability was dissolving in real time. And the Sheikh raised his hand once more, not to silence but to acknowledge, and in that gesture alone the room understood that the balance had shifted completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. And as the reality of that shift settled into every corner of the hall, Lily remained exactly as she had always been, steady, quiet, and now unmistakably seen. The Sheikh's silence lingered even after his gesture of acknowledgement, as if he was allowing the meaning of what had just occurred to fully settle not only in the room, but within the minds of everyone present. And Lily stood where she was, still and composed, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, no longer carrying the tray, no longer performing the role that had once made her invisible, while the atmosphere around her continued to shift in subtle but irreversible ways. And Sheikh Omar Al-Hadi finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, not designed to command the room but to address her directly. And when he did, he asked her a question not from the test but from curiosity, a question that carried respect rather than evaluation, and the difference was immediately felt by everyone listening. Because this was no longer about proving knowledge but about understanding its origin, and Lily hesitated only for a moment, not out of uncertainty but out of something closer to reflection, as if the answer required her to acknowledge a part of her life she had long kept private. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady, explaining that her understanding did not come from institutions or formal prestige, but from years of study guided by someone who valued knowledge above recognition, her father, a man who had taught her not for achievement, but for truth. And as she spoke, the image of that unseen world began to form in the minds of those listening, a world far removed from the polished environment they occupied, yet far more disciplined in its own quiet way. And across the room Vanessa stood motionless, her earlier assumptions now replaced by a kind of disbelief that had no immediate place to go, because everything she had used to measure worth had been rendered incomplete in a matter of minutes. And the Sheikh nodded slowly, absorbing her words, then turned his gaze briefly toward the others in the room, as if to remind them that intelligence was not confined to titles or backgrounds, before returning his attention to Lily. And what he said next changed the tone of the entire gathering, because it was no longer an observation but an invitation, a recognition that her understanding was not accidental but rare, something that deserved space rather than doubt. And he suggested that someone with her depth of interpretation should not remain unseen in environments that valued only appearance over substance. And as those words landed, a quiet tension spread through the room, not of conflict but of recalibration, as people began to realize the implications of what they had just witnessed. And Lily remained still as she processed the moment, not reacting with shock or pride, but with a calm awareness that the world she had quietly observed for so long was now observing her in return. And in that mutual recognition something fundamental had shifted, not just in status, but in perception itself, as if a door that had always been locked from the outside had finally begun to open from within. The room had entered a state that no one inside it could easily describe, because what had begun as a formal evaluation had transformed into something far more unsettling and far more significant. And Lily stood at the center of it not as a participant trying to prove herself, but as someone whose presence had already rewritten the meaning of the moment. While Sheikh Omar Al-Hadi remained still for several seconds after his last words, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if measuring not only her abilities but the path that had shaped them. And then slowly he turned slightly toward the rest of the room, his expression composed but firm, And when he spoke again, his tone carried a finality that shifted every remaining expectation in the space, because he made it clear that the purpose of the gathering had changed in that instant, that what they had witnessed was no longer about selection or comparison, but about recognition. And as those words settled, a wave of quiet unease passed through the assembled guests, not because of disagreement, but because of realization, and Vanessa stood rigid, her earlier composure completely dissolved now. Her eyes fixed on Lily as if trying to reconcile what she had seen with everything she had believed about hierarchy and worth, while others around her lowered their gazes or exchanged uncertain looks, and Lily remained motionless, her expression calm but distant, as though she were observing the entire scene from a place slightly removed from herself. And in that stillness the Sheikh addressed her once more, this time not with questions or evaluation, but with an offer that carried weight far beyond the room itself, suggesting a path that would place her knowledge in environments where it could be developed and respected. And as he spoke, the meaning behind his words extended outward, implying opportunities that had never been accessible to someone in her position before. And for the first time, a subtle shift appeared in Lily's expression, not of surprise, but of internal conflict, because recognition from the world she had never sought approval from now came directly to her, and she glanced down briefly, as if hearing her father's voice again in memory, reminding her that knowledge was never meant to be hidden, but also never meant to be chased for status. And that balance weighed on her in silence while the room waited, not impatiently, but attentively, as if even they understood that what happened next would not simply define her decision, but redefine how they all understood the value of what they had witnessed. And in that suspended moment, with every gaze quietly fixed upon her, Lily stood between the life she had always known and a future she had never imagined, neither moving forward nor stepping back, but holding the space where both worlds met. The room remained perfectly still, as if even time itself was waiting for Lily Carter to decide what kind of future she would step into. And in that silence the weight of every gaze felt different now, no longer judgmental but anticipatory, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that would define more than just a single outcome. And Sheikh Omar al-Hadi stood with calm patience, his expression no longer that of an evaluator, but of someone who had already recognized something rare and was simply waiting for it to be acknowledged by the world around him. While Lily stood at the center of it all, her mind no longer in the room, but somewhere far quieter, where memories of her father's voice, patient and unwavering, seemed to echo through every lesson he had ever given her, reminding her that knowledge carried responsibility but never demanded surrender of self. And as she lifted her eyes again, the room collectively held its breath without realizing it, because the shift in her posture was subtle yet undeniable, a quiet alignment between thought and resolve. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, not loud but clear enough to carry through every corner of the hall, expressing gratitude not for status or elevation, but for recognition itself, while also acknowledging that her path had never been shaped by visibility, but by understanding, and that whatever direction her life would take, it would remain grounded in the same principles that had brought her here. And as she finished speaking, a quiet stillness followed that felt almost reverent, as if the room itself had been recalibrated, and Sheikh Omar al-Hadi nodded slowly, accepting her words without pressure or insistence, only respect. And then he extended his offer once more, not as a demand, but as an open door, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. And in that moment Lily looked around the room, seeing not enemies or judges, but witnesses to a truth none of them had expected to encounter. And even Vanessa, who had once carried herself with effortless certainty, now stood without words, her expression no longer sharp but distant, as if she too had been forced into reflection by what could not be undone. And after a long pause that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of the moment itself, Lily gave a small, calm nod, not of submission but of understanding, accepting not the elevation of status but the continuation of her path in a broader space where her knowledge might serve a greater purpose. And as she did, something subtle yet profound shifted across the room, not marked by applause or reaction but by realization, because everyone present understood that they had not simply witnessed talent being discovered, they had witnessed dignity being recognized without compromise. And as the Sheikh extended his hand in quiet acknowledgement, Lily met it with steady composure, sealing not an ending but the beginning of a new chapter, defined not by where she came from, but by what she carried within her. And in the aftermath of that moment, as conversations remained unspoken and judgments dissolved into reflection, the truth lingered clearly in every mind present. That worth had never been defined by the roles people